Good morning, afternoon. Thank you for joining us at the 18th Annual Acquisition Research Symposium hosted by the Acquisition Research Program at the Naval Postgraduate School. And welcome to panel number 21, the Principles for Managing Software Acquisition. I am Robert Stoddard from the Software Engineering Institute, and I'll be chairing this panel. I'm joined by panelists David Tate, Nick Guertin, and Kenney. I will first introduce our panelists, and then I'll begin our conversation today with some opening remarks. Then each of the panelists will give their presentations. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to pose questions for the panelists. We will answer questions after everyone has presented. So to begin with, David Tate will be presenting a paper titled Factors Limiting the Speed of Software Acquisition. David joined the research staff of the Institute for Defense Analysis, Cost Analysis and Research Division in 2000. Prior to that, he was an assistant professor of industrial engineering at the University of Pittsburgh and the senior operations research analyst for Decision Science Applications, Inc. David has worked on a wide variety of resource analysis and quantitative modeling projects related to national security. David holds bachelor degrees in philosophy and mathematical sciences from the Johns Hopkins University and MS and Ph.D. degrees in operation research from Cornell University. Nick Guertin will be our second speaker. He'll be presenting a paper entitled Using Value Engineering to Propel Cyber-Physical System Acquisition. Nick is a senior software systems engineer at Carnegie Mellon University's Software Engineering Institute. He received a BS in engineering from the University of Washington and an MBA from Bryant University, and is a registered professional engineer. He provides engineering and transformational leadership to programs in the system acquisition and engineering communities. And third, Kenney will be our wrap-up speaker. She'll be presenting a paper titled Integration of Production Management into Software Development and Acquisition Processes. Caitlin is a systems engineer and Agile coach for International Systems Management Corporation. She has an MS in system engineering from University of Maryland and a BS in industrial engineering from Northeastern University. Caitlin is currently pursuing a Ph.D. in civil engineering, project management at the University of Maryland. She has over 10 years of experience supporting DoD projects and is a licensed professional engineer in Illinois and Maryland. All three of these presentations address principles of managing software acquisition, but from very different angles. David will kick off the panel with the field observations surrounding 7 factors that limit the speed of software acquisition. The observations and lessons learned will be shared in context of the themes of minimum viable product and minimum viable capability release. Nick will discuss how value engineering may be employed to motivate wider adoption of both architecture-centric vertical integration and model-based engineering by contractors developing complex cyber-physical systems. This will include field observations, challenges, and future opportunities for continued research. Caitlin will round out the panel by discussing preliminary research into the application of the 5 levers of production management: product design, process design, capacity, work in process, and variability to improve software development and acquisition. Her talk will center on 4 research questions within her doctoral work and phase 1 initial observations from the literature. At this time, I'd like to hand it off to David Tate.
Thanks, Bob. Happy to be with you here today. Oh, it won't let me turn my video on now. Let's try that. Okay. Happy to be here and to present with such a great crew. I'm going to be talking about software speed limits, right? What is it that controls how fast we can modernize our software, develop our software, maintain our software? This is joint work with John Bailey that we did at the Institute for Defense Analyses. Start by saying everyone agrees that we need to go faster, right? We need to get our capabilities fielded faster. We need to be able to stay within the development cycles of our adversaries. And everyone also agrees that our future capabilities are going to be software enabled. Software is an increasing fraction of how we accomplish what it is that we do. So there's nothing controversial about the claim that we want to go faster and that we need to go faster. The question is, what's limiting our ability to go faster? And I'm going to argue that software is what's limiting our ability to go faster. I presented a paper here a couple of years ago showing that if you look back at major acquisition programs and compare how much software they required with a basic Kokomo projection of how long it would take to develop that software, you discover that you have rediscovered the boundary of how long it actually took to develop those programs. So there's some strong evidence here that software is the long pole in the tent at the moment. So we looked at historical software programs in the literature and did some analysis of our own. And we came up with 7 factors that we think are the key limiting factors on how fast you can go in doing software. I won't read the list to you here. I'm going to go through them in turn, but given the time restrictions, I'm just going to be making pontificating pronouncements. The evidence and the arguments and the citations that go behind that are in the paper, which I encourage you to read. So the first limiting factor is what you want the software to do. This seems obvious to any cost analyst, right? And you know that it's more expensive and takes longer to design and build an aircraft carrier than a dry cargo ship. The content of the project is the key driver in how long it takes. But because software is intangible, people often forget this, at least temporarily. And because it's so hard to predict how much software you're going to need in advance, there's a tendency to sort of think we can go faster by moral willpower rather than by reducing what it is we're asking for. There's a well-established literature that there's an optimum pace of development, that if you do everything just right with parallelism in the development where it's justified and no concurrency where it's not justified, then you can get through at minimum cost. If you're slower than that, then you're kind of wasting time and burning extra money. If you try to go faster than that, there's a limited extent to which you can expedite, but in large measure, you soon become infeasible. You just break the project. And I'll note that Agile development, while I love Agile development, it doesn't fix this basic problem in the sense that for a given fixed amount of content, right, the things the system must do, Agile isn't really faster than traditional waterfall methods. Agile gets faster because it avoids work. It doesn't bother to do the things that turn out to not be so very important to include in the overall system, right? But what this means is that if you have a software requirement, a mission need, where the minimum viable capability release is complicated all by itself, right? That the architecture and cybersecurity and minimum capabilities are a large project, you can't speed that up by being agile. You can maybe make improvements to it later more efficiently and faster than you could, and you can get to that minimum release faster than you could if you had tried to do all of the future developments all at once, but you're not going to speed up that MVCR release by being agile. And I mentioned architecture here. The architecture is the second important factor, that what you are requiring in terms of the structure and organization of your software limits what you can do later, but also adds burden on what you are doing now. The analogy I give here is my car is designed in such a way that I can easily change and improve the tires. It's much harder to change and improve a door. That was deliberate because people thought it was more important to be able to change tires than doors, but it imposes very real restrictions on which kinds of upgrades to my car are easy and which kinds are hard. And the architecture is part of the MVCR, right? That you have to decide the architecture up front and you have to implement the architecture you're going to use all the way through the life cycle of the product. It's extremely expensive to go back and change the architecture later. This includes the cybersecurity design, right? So there's a lot of stuff that has to be included in that MVCR that you can't spit out if you want to get to a viable capability release that could be used in the field. Third point is technological maturity. This is familiar for hardware systems. Everybody understands that airborne laser was a lot more challenging to develop than cargo aircraft because of the immaturity of the technologies involved. There are software technologies that are immature at any given time. The big one today is use of machine learning and other artificial intelligence techniques in autonomous systems. This is an immature technology. It's going to take longer to develop that than it would a comparable number of lines of code of more mature, more well understood software technologies. And I'll note immature hardware can also affect the software because once you're bending metal in the project, it's easier for people to think, okay, well, that would be hard to redesign and go back to the drawing board on, so we'll fix it in software. And so you get new software requirements that are driven by the immaturity of the hardware, and that affects how fast you can finish your project. Resources are obviously vitally important. Most cost estimates are written as if you had infinite funds and infinite workforce, and you were then always surprised when it takes longer to do because you didn't have infinite funds in the budget and you didn't have infinite labor to do the work. I have argued in recent years that there is a current and increasing shortfall in the defense software industrial base, that the amount of software we are asking for to be developed and maintained is more than the current industrial base can maintain, and that gap is getting bigger. And we see that through a number of different signs. I'll point you again back to a previous ARS paper that I presented on that subject, but it's a real factor, right? That you can't get the people you need at the time you need them really is going to make it take longer for you to deliver your product. Next factor is testing strategy. Testing is something that program managers hate because it looks like a dead expense for no real benefit. But paper after paper has established that correcting defects is the #1 delay in delivering capability, and that the later you wait to correct them, the more expensive they are and the longer they take to fix. So prioritizing software defect elimination and managing technical debt is, again, a key piece of current Agile and DevSecOps approaches. If you do it right, testing is free. The project costs less than it would have cost if you hadn't done the testing, right? But that's a very hard argument to make to a project manager who needs the money for testing today, and therefore it hits against the current budget. Whereas if you defer that, then you might get lucky and not need it later. I'm going to skip quickly over contract structure, but I will note that there are aspects of how we contract for software that affect how long it takes, especially when you're talking about how long it takes to do modifications down the road, as opposed to the initial development of the software. I just got out of a very interesting session in the previous session here, where the idea came up that one of the benefits of organic government software development is that you do not have to manage all of the contract terms and negotiate the cleanse and renegotiate, who's on the hook for what and what people get paid for, that there's a friction associated with managing the contract that you don't have if the software is being written by government personnel. There's also the mismatch between what the government wants and what the contractor is actually on contract to provide and will get paid for that you avoid when it's organic software development, right? And I'll skip my little lecture here on monopoly incentives. Next factor is change management. change management is a vital aspect of how you make the changes that we always make over time. Again, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over this. I encourage you to read that section of the paper. Which brings me to my bottom line. So bottom line at the bottom, software takes time. It takes time for valid reasons. How much time it's going to take is determined mostly by what we want it to do and what kind of future upgradability we want to build into that. To go really fast in the future, we need to make choices up front that are sometimes slow and painful and don't look like fast choices, but they enable a life cycle that does enable fast improvements over time. So it's a pay me now or pay me later kind of situation. That depends on architectures, that depends on data rights, and I'll finish just by saying, yeah, we probably should be worried about the industrial base too that supports this. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
All right, thank you for this opportunity to talk about something that Fred and I identified when we were working on a project, and how could we codify the improvement of the development of software for embedded computing systems. And we latched on to the ideas around value engineering in order to harmonize how we might do that approach, and then we wrote a paper on it. So as we get into that, Fred, why don't you talk about what we want people to walk away from as we finish this discussion?
Well, hopefully they're not going to walk away from this presentation, but we want to make sure that we're clear about what we're talking about. And the first thing is just to be clear about value engineering principles. And we're not using value engineering as it's written in the Mill standard. We're using these principles because we need to change the way that we are doing business, and we need to stimulate new ideas, new approaches. And we want these principles, so that would be an investment in the contractor's process in order to drive an outcome. And the outcome that we want is to identify and mitigate showstopper defects early in life cycle. And we want to reward innovations that lead us to that point. Because what we've noticed over the last, we've been in the industry for a long time, and I can't point to a system where we've had the outcome that we wanted. We have these issues that force us to cut back on quantities or pay extra for cost overruns and delay delivery of the platform to the warfighter. Or we trade off capability because we can't get it all done with the funding that we have. So that's kind of like the reality. It happens every single time. And we are aware, as Nick pointed out from our prior work, of improved product development technologies that maybe could apply and help to reduce risk, but they haven't been widely adopted, and they haven't even had really a fair shake at being adopted. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but whenever you try things new, it's risky, and you sort of, even though you have a really not very good way of producing your product now, if you try this new way, it might even be worse, which it's possible it could be. But right now, what we know is that we're finding things way too late in the development process. And when we find them, because we find them so late, they cost way more than they should have cost when if we had found them earlier. And we don't have enough knowledge about why we didn't find them when we should have. So, and this is still going on. So on recent GAO report on F-35, it still has, at this point, 10 years after it was originally released, 872 defects, of which 11 are safety critical. And in the last release, they didn't find 23, I think it was 23% of their defects were found in flight test, which is just wrong. So we need to motivate a new way to think about how to do these systems.
So talk about motivation, and in that is some mechanism for reward. So where are we going to go to find the funding to motivate this concept?
Well, like we pointed out in the, we wind up paying way more than we should at the end to make it work. And the graphic in the upper right talks about it's a characterization, but we sort of burn through all of our money and we burn through all of our schedule, and we claim that we are ready to go into test, but then we find that there's all these issues that arise, and we need extra funding to finish integration, and we need to make the vehicle work, and we do these things to trade off capability or to just pay more for it. So that's the money. We just need to recognize that it's going to happen, and it's a significant chunk of money. Like on F-35, I think it's in the billions of dollars. So we should be able to find something to try from that pool to pay forward and try innovations earlier to identify defects earlier in life cycle. The graphic on the lower left talks about where we're finding these defects, and from the research, we're seeing that as much as 80% of the faults are discovered after unit tests, and they cost up to 1,000 times more to fix them.
So hard to argue the point, Fred, but how would actually implement this in some kind of a workflow, a relationship between industry and government?
Well, the workflow implications are quite challenging, and it's a complex, I hate to use the word ecosystem, but there are government acquirers that have a varying degree of technical capability. There are certification authorities, cyber, safety critical. This is a cyber physical system, so safety critical is paramount. There is a prime contractor, potentially multiple prime contractors and subcontractors, and they all have their way of doing business, and integrating a new process into a workflow in a standard way is a challenge. I think we've all seen that. Plus, within each organization, there are different groups, factions. So there's there's systems engineering and software engineering and so on, and test and evaluation. So what we've tried to do with the graphic is just highlight the types of things that we expect to be done within a model-based engineering environment, which is certainly part of what we're arguing for. And the cylinders are representing databases. We're not trying to draw lines intentionally about who's doing what and how the data gets into the model. And but with so much variability, there are so many different options that exist, and we can't be prescriptive. We need people just to try things and see what works, and then go from there. And we believe fundamentally that that this approach is going to drive down risk. So, Nick, do you have any experience with how that might work?
Yeah, Fred, thanks. So typically, risks are acknowledged, and you identify a set of actions to drive down the likelihood of that risk. But because we're dealing with something that's a near metaphysical certainty, that is cost and schedule breaches on cyber physical systems, we need to change the game. We need to come at it with a different approach and address problems much earlier in the design synthesis stage in order to drive down the consequence of realized or identified risks, as well as take our classic set of steps for driving down likelihood. So in the paper, we detail out what those consequence reduction methods are, and it gets a lot in doing model-based engineering and taking advantage of architectural analysis. And then what are the things we need to do to drive down our likelihoods for addressing things like analyze prior to committing, and then also how broadly can we apply this set of practices. We argue that this can be applied at the military platform level and all the stuff that goes in it, the systems, the subsystems, and even down to the modules when you're developing things using a modular open systems approach.
Are there existing contracting mechanisms that we can take advantage of?
Definitely. I've worked on both contracts from the government side as well as developing guidance for how contracts are written. And I've talked a lot with industry leaders who told me that, look, the first thing they want to do is identify, can they win? what are the mechanisms by which they can get awarded the contract. So they're looking for the source selection evaluation factors that will help them understand, can they win? And then they also look at, can I make money at this? What are the cost basis and the incentive mechanisms that they can be rewarded by? And so those two things grab industry's attention and force them to commit to a set of practices that will be contractually obligated. So one of the things that we prescribe in our paper is the use of these mechanisms of inserting value engineering in source selection evaluation factors and tying them into the award mechanisms or the incentive mechanisms that are inherently a part of a cost plus contract. These are high risk development activities. So we're definitely in the cost type contract as opposed to fixed type contract, but we have lots of creativity options when it comes to how to reward good behavior. And so we want to see how those would be wired into the contract from the very beginning and be applied across the entire contract period so that we continue to reap that benefit and make it a continuum of process reform in order to improve the approach from the beginning throughout the development and delivery of the capability. Right. So, Fred, given that, how about we go through some of the recommendations that we put together when it comes to putting all this into motion?
So the first and most important recommendation we have is to build metrics or a process performance baseline that focuses on these issues that arise late in life cycle, getting rid of them, finding them earlier, and preventing them from occurring. So these are process changes that we can't really determine whether they're effective if we don't have a solid baseline to measure from. So we also need trailblazers out there. We need local process change agents that have the gumption to try new things and assess whether or not they work. So if we have the baseline in place, we can try new things. We can tweak this, do that. We incorporate the things that work into a new process status quo, and then we do it all over again. It's like continuous process improvement. So we really need to build, like I said, these the metrics to support a process improvement mindset that focuses on these defects, and then we need to move those processes up into the enterprise level. So those are the three main things that we are recommending. We want to thank you all for listening and acknowledge that this is actually a value proposition that makes sense to improve our acquisition of cyber physical systems. Nick?
Again, thanks for everybody. And when it's our turn, we'll take questions.
Hello, my name is Kenney, and I am a doctoral candidate from the University of Maryland Civil Engineering Project Management Program. I'm also a systems engineer at International Systems Management Corps, supporting U.S. Navy software development and Agile projects. Production management is the application of operations management and science to production systems. Traditional project delivery focused on productivity measures. However, productivity does not equate to throughput or outcomes. Projects can have very high productivity measures and still fail to deliver. This is a result of poor flow through a system, failure to address and exploit bottlenecks, and failure to control work in process or WIP. To improve project cost, schedule, and performance, a deeper understanding of what happens throughout the life cycle of a project is needed. Traditional project management triple constraints of cost, schedule, and performance have long been the cornerstone of DoD software project management. Often these constraints are managed independently using past performance data to assess and predict future project performance, leading to high variable outcomes. Traditional waterfall models for software project delivery exacerbate this variability and limit the ability to deliver capability at the speed of relevance. By treating projects as a production system, a deeper understanding of planning variables, product design and process design, and execution variables, including capacity planning, limiting work in process, and variability, can be achieved and close the gap on project delivery performance. This research is the focus of my PhD studies at the University of Maryland, the results of which are ongoing. But the goal of this presentation is to share the preliminary results of the literature review using publicly available data and well-established production management and operations science techniques. The first step in understanding how current Agile projects are applying the 5 production management levers is to manage and control software delivery, is to understand where they're applying these to their current projects or if they're applying them at all. Many projects have adopted an Agile approaches and frameworks, but with wide variability in terms of success. And in order to understand the root cause of the variability, we need to understand what is missing in these self-described Agile projects. First, what exactly is production management and how can it impact project delivery? If you work in project management, you're all too familiar with the graphic on this slide. The myth is that we need to prioritize the elements of the triangle, but often we're actually trying to find balance or even project equilibrium, which is not feasible or realistic. Further, we often try to fix these elements without understanding what the downstream impacts to our project delivery will be. So for example, if we fix scope and schedule, our costs may rise to meet a set of requirements and deadlines. And this isn't inherently bad, but it becomes a challenge when we also impose limits to funding and therefore fix our cost. We often don't have enough information about the work to make such assumptions about how we can deliver exactly to these targets. And often we find out more information as the project progresses. More often than not right now, we're delivering software projects late and over budget. Production management is the application of operations science techniques to the management of the project or production process as a system. The idea is to look at project execution as a whole system, not as individual phases. It's a well-established concept that's been in practice within the manufacturing industry for decades, and it's foundational to Agile project management, which focuses on cross-functional, collaborative approaches to achieve a desired outcome or product. Too often, projects are focused on productivity. However, productivity is not indicative of throughput or outcomes. Production management uses 5 levers shown here on the left, which include product design, process design, capacity, work in process, and variability to better not only control, but also help monitor how projects are performing. Product design focuses on controlling the scope of a project through product requirements. Specifically, product design focuses on developing the business case, including the potential use cases and value it will deliver to the end user. It doesn't mean that all engineering is done up front. It's done just in time with the latest inputs and user feedback available. It also doesn't mean that you start with no requirements. You do have requirements, but they're often at a higher level and more focused on the functionality and use of the end user who's going to use that product. Vice the lower level details about how to design something. You're really trying to understand why and what problem you're trying to solve. Process design is key to understanding communication channels, flows, queues, and sequencing of work. And there are many well-established Agile frameworks that support this concept as a way to control and monitor throughput. Too often, we don't really understand the communication channels or the various handoffs or integration points that are needed across various groups with different skill sets, experience, and knowledge. And often we run into bottlenecks because we don't understand these communication channels or how work and information flows. Capacity is the amount of work a project can support, bound by the resources, time, and skill sets available. Too often, projects plan independent of capacity and then experience delays in schedules, increases to costs, and miss scope because the capacity of the team and the environment in which they must execute the project are not understood. Work in process, or WIP, is also a major driver of variability within any project, not just software. WIP ties up resources, slows down our progress, and decreases our overall throughput. It creates unnecessary dependencies within a production system that can hinder delivery. However, WIP isn't all bad. Understanding WIP limits can help projects better understand their capacity and improve overall throughput and delivery. And finally, the fifth lever is variability, both good and bad. It comes in many forms for software projects, and it can include things like process variation and or quality, time variation, and product variation. A common example of something that would be a detrimental variation within a software project is having to rework a product due to quality and testing issues. This is bad. We don't want to do that, right? But sometimes there's beneficial variability in that maybe we complete work a little bit early, or maybe we're able to pull work forward from our backlog because we got new information or we have additional resources and the right skill sets to do the work. A deeper understanding and an application of these levers can help improve our overall project performance by providing more telemetry data to support data-based decision-making on software projects. To understand how this is all related to project performance, it's important to understand what's happening when projects are not delivering within cost and schedule. Little's Law, which is shown above, explains how WIP impacts overall throughput and project performance. Limiting WIP, not necessarily eliminating, can provide more consistent results for throughput over time, as variability in cycle time, which is often caused by the humans in the loop, can impact the overall flow. We often talk about lead time without truly understanding cycle time, and understanding both is critical for how we design our processes and can have impacts, both good and bad, on our overall project delivery because it results in variability and also impacts our overall capacity planning. Without understanding how all 5 of these levers play together and how they impact one another, we don't truly understand our project as a system, and therefore we're more likely to miss our targets when it comes to cost, schedule, and scope. So the method and approach for this research starts with a review of the policies and recommendations being made to support Agile software delivery within the DoD. There are a number of resources that were reviewed, including the OUSD A&S guides for Agile contracting, Agile 101, minimal viable products and road mapping, and Agile metrics. Further resources on the adaptive acquisition strategy to support Agile software projects, the DevSecOps best practices, Defense Innovation Board recommendations, and GAO-related Agile best practice guides were also reviewed. To identify how projects are actually applying all these recommendations, I looked at the 2020 June GAO report on defense acquisitions annual assessment, as well as a number of papers on Agile software delivery projects within the DoD and other government-related activities. The various policy guides reviewed all support the 5 production levers with appropriate metrics targeted to support control of product design, process design, capacity, work in process, and variability. For example, the OUSD A&S Agile Metrics Guide recommends a series of Agile process, quality, product, DevSecOps, cost, and value metrics. Further, contracting guidelines also recommend similar metrics that support the 5 levers. However, a review of the Agile software delivery projects had more mixed results. The GAO reports, for example, reported that 22 surveyed programs, only 6 of which, 22 programs that stated they were using Agile, only 6 of which were actually delivering software in step with commercial industry delivery cadences and best practices. Further, many of these programs still had requirements for things like earned value management, integrated master schedules, and traditional SETR events, indicating that they had fixed upfront requirements and lacked the flexibility to control their own product design, process design, capacity, work in process, and overall variability. The next step is to review RFPs for new Agile software projects and see how the guidelines are actually being applied. Many of the projects reported to have adopted Agile approaches have existing contracts in place that likely limit the flexibility of the project to truly adopt Agile, leaving them Agile in name only. An understanding of how these guidelines are being leveraged for new projects will give a better indication of the software project delivery trends within the DoD. Thank you for your time today, and I look forward to any questions and discussion.
All right, I'm back. All right, thank you, David, Nick, and Caitlin. I guess we're now opening up the floor for questions. I see one in the Q&A. And the question is, should a software project manager have a BS computer science degree as a minimum? And I'm guessing that's probably to Caitlin, possibly.
Yeah, so I'd be happy to take that question. So I think that when we talk about the industrial base, and if we limit ourselves to folks based on their degree, whether it's computer science or computer engineering, I think that's an overly restrictive way to view the world. So personally, I'm an industrial engineer with a systems engineering background. I've done that most of my career. I've taken programming and coding and all these other things, so I have fundamental understandings of those, but you don't want me being the person to develop your software, right? That's not my skill set. My strength is going to be in the organization and understanding the interdependencies of how to execute on that. So, well, I think it's definitely a great benefit to have folks with those types of degrees in those roles. I don't think it's a requirement or necessary in terms of, whether or not a project is successful. I think it ultimately comes down to how well does a person in a project manager role truly understand what's happening underneath the hood, so to speak, of how to execute and deliver on that overall project.
I would like to camp on that one and just say that a systems perspective is especially important when your software branches out into the physical aspects as well. I've mentored a handful of different undergraduates who they were asking me about what to do. I said, make sure you take a software coding class. If you're an industrial engineer, mechanical engineer, electrical, regardless of your discipline, you need to understand how to interact with software and how to be a part of that ecosystem.
I'll note, just piling on that DoD as a rule is moving away from degree requirements for specific positions and moving toward a more nuanced credentialing system where people would have specific credentials in their functional areas, and those could be fairly narrow and they expire. So there's a certain currency requirement that goes with it. But that allows for a more targeted specification of what the skills are you need to do a particular job.
Okay, I think I'm back. Sorry, guys. What's going on with the bandwidth? Okay, we have another question. Was a measure of culture type included in any of the studies? I believe that's for Caitlin as well, I'm guessing.
Yeah, so I can answer that. So just to clarify, so I'm still very early in my research. So most of the things that I presented today are kind of initial literature review. There was mention of some cultural, but I don't think we have any sort of standard measurements for how we're measuring culture in these projects. That would be an interesting metric for us to develop and research more, but I didn't see anything in terms of there's some sort of standard thing that we look for. I think in my experience with these projects in my work life, right, versus my school life, is that culture is often a measure of that overall throughput, right? And understanding your bottlenecks. And if you're running into a lot of bottlenecks, that's probably more indicative of the fact that you have a longer way to go on the cultural side for your Agile transformation. And that those things just take time and education, right? And having thoughtful, thought-provoking conversations to help people better understand kind of where you're heading and that you do share a common goal, right? It's just a slightly different way of getting there.
Yeah, I'd like to add as well that culture is a manifestation of behavior, and behavior shaping is a big part of transforming a culture. And that's why in our research, we camped on the idea of how do we shape behavior in terms of what we were prescribing. And that's one of the reasons why we went to look at, well, what do we require the contractors to do? And how do we work on a workflow for the government side of it to be a part of that new set of behaviors? And ultimately that will end up shaping a culture.
I'll just add on to that because that's a really great point too. Culture is one of those hard things that you can't force it, right? You can set in all the guardrails and the guidelines to help foster that, right? But it's not something that can be forced. It's something that has to be, I can't force you to change, right? If you don't want to change, you're not going to change, right? But that's something it's a continuous conversation and it just takes time.
Okay, another question for Caitlin from Bobby Sharma. You mentioned that only 6 out of 22 actually followed the Agile principles. Do you have some insight into the success of those 6? Did they deliver the desired outcome?
Yeah, so that particular report, they were delivering within what we consider industry standards, which I think is delivering, within every 6 to 8 weeks, I think is the metric they used. But for the groups that were not, right, it was often cases they were using some principles of Agile, but they weren't delivering. They were still taking a year, or more to deliver on their software, which ultimately probably is more indicative of the fact that we're just really early in our Agile journey for some of these projects, right? And it's that time and culture piece that's going to have to work through the transition. But I'm not sure if I answered the question, but.
Okay. And another follow-up question on the culture topic. Are there any proposed culture measures anybody is considering and know about? I don't know if any of the panelists have heard of anything on that.
I'm not aware of anything off the top of my head. It sounds like a good topic to jump in on.
I know in my background at Texas Instruments, we had a lot of international joint projects. And so we did have measures about how people communicated, and we used that to find out if things were getting off the track. So it wasn't scientific at the time, though.
Yeah, I would imagine that there's a lot of probably voice of customer type of metrics that could be applied, right? Because if ultimately you're looking for, sign of good culture means that you have satisfied end users, right? Satisfied end folks. So there's probably some things there, but I personally haven't seen anything proposed yet.
I don't see any more in the Q&A window, so I did develop a few myself, and I think we do have some time. So, yes.
Sorry, there was one question that Greg Sanders answered that asked that I answered in the text, but I would like to say a couple more words about that, if you don't mind.
Yes, go ahead.
So he said the industrial-based tension that I talked about seems like a hard problem. Well, what can you do about it, right? What are our best options for contract structures, IP, data rights, ways to pay now to access defense industrial-based capability, but still have systems that are maintainable? And so I mentioned there are proposals for licensing, where the original developer gets paid every time someone else successfully develops something that is integrated into that system. There's objective measures for how modular and open your architecture is that could be applied either as contract requirements or as the basis for some kind of incentive award. And then, we talked about organic government development, which avoids some of the bad incentives. I also think it would be very interesting to see if competitions were run with a requirement of 2 proposals, one with full government data rights and one with the contractor's preferred data rights structure. the price difference between those could be very informative in sort of deciding how bad the problem is and what sort of incentives would be effective. Over.
Okay, thank you. I have a few more questions now. Let's see. Tools are good if you know how to use it properly. Is there a way to measure how well Agile projects not only use Agile, but use the appropriate tool? Education should be key.
Yeah, so there are some baseline metrics, right? They're maybe not necessarily specific to tools, but specific to Agile applications. So for example, we're going to get in the weeds for a second. I hope that's okay. But for example, if you were talking about, how well are teams estimating their work and performing against those estimates, you would look at things like, story point analysis and look at your team velocity and look at your burn down charts and things like that. Those can be indicative of how well you're actually applying. And if you're seeing a lot of variability in those reports, then you could, that's when you sit down and have a conversation with your team and try to understand, what's the root cause here? Is it that we're just really bad at estimating? Is it that our team is getting interrupted in the middle of their sprint to go do something emergent? Right. So there's many ways to do that. And I think it's just indicative of when we talk about tools, right? There's tools for how we manage our work. There's tools for how we manage our software. There's tools for how we manage our testing, manage our defects, things like that as well. So there's metrics in all of those things, but it depends on kind of what you're interested in terms of how specific you could get.
And that leads to, I'm going to skip a question so I can stay with Caitlin to continue this discussion. Caitlin, in your literature review, have you read anything about how the Future Vertical Lift program is managing software development?
I've seen it mentioned, but I'll be honest, I haven't seen a lot of details about how they're actually implementing. So that actually could be a good future topic for me to dig into. But so I have seen it mentioned, but I haven't seen a lot of details on it.
Sorry, Zoom kicked me out. Let's see here. Yeah, just reading the rest of it. How are we using lessons learned from the past to avoid future software issues, interoperability, upgradability, joint operations, multi-domain operations, integration with civil aeronautics, FAA, integration with GPS, STEM, etc.?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd like to take that one a little bit.
Okay.
One of the things that the Army has done, especially PO Aviation, is required the use of standards that they've put a lot of time and energy into, like Future Airborne Capability Environment reference framework. They also did some architectural work in advance of doing some prototyping activities known as the capstone effort, where they looked at, how would industry approach some of the things like applying that standard, using modular open system approaches, the application of use of architecture-centric virtual integration, and a result of that, those pre full solicitation activities informed a prototyping effort that they're doing. So they're going to prototype 2 different aircraft variants by 2 different vendors. They'll end up with 4 different implementation efforts before they make a commitment to the full contract for productionization of 2 different aircraft types. So there's a lot going on there in advance of letting out the final contract. That I think I would have to say that it's better than a lot of others I've seen, and maybe not necessarily perfect, but pretty good, all things considered.
Okay, Nick, this next question may initially at least target you. It says, great session. What are your thoughts for programs to help them identify risks associated with interactions between various cyber physical factors?
Nick, you went on mute.
Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
I actually hit the mute button when I was unmuted. So sorry about that. If you'd only heard my answer, it would have been great. But so anyway, it goes right to the heart of one of the, so in our paper, we talk about, the value engineering as a surrogate idea for creating win-win opportunities between government and industry. And to get into the particulars of how we would use architecture-centric virtual integration as the mechanism, as an approach for doing that VE transformation. And in the context of that, using early stage design activities that you would do, say, in the architecture and analysis description language, which actually is something that we've worked on at the Software Engineering Institute, and do a lot of that early concept exploration and interaction modeling in advance of making a commitment to full productionization of software. So you can find out whether or not it's going to get close to working before you actually build it. And then keeping the model alive as you go forward gives you an opportunity to look at what will happen when I add that new feature or that new capability. I test it in my architecture-centric integration environment first before making a full commitment to the productionization of whatever that new thing is. So those are big steps in doing that risk mitigation on that part of a cyber physical system that is the most problematic for late stage problem discovery.
I would add that we just saw a talk in the previous session from Dr. Pugliese at Cornell about spectral complexity measures for graphs that are based on the design of the system. So for a cyber physical system, especially if you're using model-based systems engineering, you have the details of the connectivity and the dependencies within the design. You can then compute a complexity measure on that connectivity to give you an idea of how tightly coupled things are and how complex the engineering of it will be in the future going forward.
Okay. David, a question I had on your talk. I was wondering which of those 7 categories of factors do you think are most prevalent, if there is one that stands out? And then also of those 7 categories, which one do you think presents the greatest challenge to the DoD to overcome?
So we listed them roughly in order of impact as we could perceive it. So it's the content is number 1, right? How hard is the thing you're asking for? That's kind of goes without saying. I think the one that is higher ranked than most people would guess is the architecture, right? The impact of the architecture on both the initial development effort and time, and then on how quickly you can do things in the future, and how long your system is liable to have a viable life, right? It's hard work to design an architecture that will be strongly forward compatible and enable easy insertion of future capabilities. And you have to guess right to some extent about what kinds of capabilities you're going to want to modify and which ones you don't. Building robust platforms might in fact be a better approach, right? To build a giant bus that you can plug all kinds of systems into without knowing in advance what kind of systems you're going to want can turn out to be a better approach than designing it to all the requirements you know today. And that takes me back to the question about requirements. I think for Agile, we still have hard requirements, right? There are firm cybersecurity and safety and, what threshold requirements are supposed to mean, right? That if it's less than this, we have no use for it. We don't usually do that. We usually set the thresholds at, if it's less than this, we can't justify the budget to Congress. So the minimum viable capability release is that true threshold set of capabilities, which can be pretty substantial all by itself. Again, the example I gave of GPS, OCX, or F-35 avionics, there are certain minimums that you have to meet there, and those are already complex cyber physical systems, a lot of lines of code.
Thank you. For Nick, I know in the paper you did describe mixed experiences adopting ACVI. And one of the comments was that in some of those cases, they had just started too late in the life cycle to adopt it. So Could you elaborate a little bit more about how much earlier they probably should have adopted it to see the great benefits?
Yeah, so one of the kind of the approaches in that particular program is that they started with a kind of come as you are approach, and so it didn't leave a lot of incentive. It also asked for a very short timeline, so it didn't leave a lot of incentive for the providers to go back and take a deep and thoughtful look at how did we build what we have. And so some of the kind of like the bow wave you have to go through to do architecture-centric integration model is you got to model it first. And it has to be a real working model. Again, it's not just a bunch of pictures and diagrams with a bunch of lightning bolts. It has to be an interactive model. And that takes a little effort up front. The value we were trying to prescribe in the paper is that you reap that value downstream, not too terribly far downstream, by wringing out those problems well in advance of finding them in the implementation. I mean, we parked a little bit hard perhaps on F-35, but there's plenty of examples out there. That's just a big juicy one of finding problems late in the development cycle. And but because it was a GAO report and we could reference it, it was a nice big fat juicy target, like I said. But the idea of doing that modeling up front so that you could find those problems before making that commitment to integration, it does require some upfront work, and it needs to have an incentive by the government to want to do that. And one of the things we were trying to point out is you're going to pay a lot of money later. And the other thing is that if what we've heard about in the past 2 days is true, that our kind of top line budget is going to be fixed or maybe slightly reduced, and every program might endure some budget haircuts, they're going to need to get creative on how to, come in on schedule, not try to find a way to find more budget later. Sorry if that was a long-winded answer.
Oh, thank you. And a question I had for Caitlin, of the initial lit review and observations you made, did anything stand out as being truly unexpected from your thinking going into that activity?
I don't think there were any surprises, so to speak. I do think, though, that we take for granted right now when we tell projects, go be agile. We take for granted the amount of lift and change, right, that's needed to actually do that, and the amount of kind of upfront investment, not necessarily like, we're not necessarily talking, dollars into hardware or something like that. We're talking investment in people, right, and training and helping them to understand the fundamentals and truly like shift their way of thinking from, kind of long, big, long linear life cycles to more incremental and iterative changes. That's hard. And that takes a lot of upfront investment. I mean, the biggest source of variability for all these projects is the human, right? It's us. And so I don't think it was a surprise necessarily, but I think for the projects that were still struggling, right, where you saw that they were still trying to manage kind of like some of the, what I'll call like, traditional waterfall type of artifacts or ceremonies and trying to like overlay Agile to that, that's where you tend to see a lot of divergency. And I haven't seen a good solution for that yet, because it's just not really understanding the ecosystem in which projects are operating today, directing a team to go be agile without giving them the relief on their, the way they're executing the deliverables they still have to provide, et cetera. It's a lose-lose situation, right? It doesn't achieve the overall goal, and you just create a lot of frustration for folks. So I don't think there were any surprises, but I do think we have a long way to go. We have a lot of really good policies and guides in place, right? There's a lot of good reporting that's been coming out over the last 4 or 5 years, but we still have a long way to go to change that culturally, I think, as a larger kind of organizational ecosystem.
Okay, thank you. I would admit I was salivating as I read your paper because my particular measurement team at the SEI, we're developing competency in modern causal inference, where you can actually go beyond a correlation study and establish cause and effect from data and the domain expertise you can get access to. So I'd love the opportunity to chat with you down the road about that.
That sounds fantastic. We should stay connected.
Okay, I think that's covering all of our questions today. Did anybody have any parting comments or answers to any of the previous questions?
I think, Bob, there was one question in the chat about how do we define requirements and help leadership and Congress understand that. I would be super interested to hear from the other members on the panel if you guys have thoughts on that.
Sure. I think, we've been down this road before under other names, right? The push for spiral development or evolutionary development back in the early 2000s was the same kind of thing, a recognition that we don't know all the things we're going to want eventually from this system, but we can get started now with something that's useful. Agile is I think, an interesting flavor of that in that it explicitly works by shedding the things that you turn out not to have needed after all, which is a very efficient way to develop. The problem has always been with making the business case to the Congress that this is something that they should fund when they don't know what they're getting in the end. So the tension, I think, really is more of a public relations tension than a technical problem with not knowing which requirements to prioritize or to make part of the initial increment of capability. Now, the truth is that we have always done spiral development covertly, right? We tell Congress that we're making 42 DDG-51 series destroyers, but we actually make, some number of each different from all the others destroyers with different capabilities. And in some ways we lie to the Congress about that, but we get the capabilities that we want and we need. So I think from a governance standpoint, it is much better to have the changing requirements and capabilities over time be visible, at least where there's no national security damage from that. But finding a way to, Congress has never been willing to say, okay, here's a pile of money over a number of years, go do something useful. That's not a management style that they like. And acquisition reform efforts that have tried to go in that direction, like TSPR, the Total System Package, whatever it stood for, failed badly, right? And I think why did they fail and could we get the benefits without the bad side would be some interesting research.
I'd like to play along on that one. So as a former submariner, I'll tell you that I think the Virginia-class program did a nice job of pulling out the mission systems away from the very expensive nuclear-powered sewer pipe, as we call it. And all of those mission systems were ACAT-3 programs. They're small programs that are allowed to evolve as they went. They were kind of forced into it. There's a long story behind that one, but I won't get into that. But the idea that they decoupled the tight integration of the mission systems away from the very expensive, long lead time platform and allowed those mission systems to evolve in a way that was natural for the pace of technology. The other thing they did was they acknowledged that the underlying compute plant that would have to go into the skin of that submarine was fungible, right? It was something that you were going to throw away regularly. And so the idea that you would produce an end state product and punch them out like Pez afterwards for 30 years is something that we really need to get away from. We need to kind of formulate the general notion that the mission systems are going to evolve, you're going to throw things away once in a while. Re-architecting is not a bad word. It's actually a healthy sign. That we need to get away from the idea of whacking a champagne bottle on the completed thing. These are software intensive things. They're always going to change. And the more we embrace that notion of change, the better we'll be prepared to pull out the things that will change fast from the things that can't possibly change fast, and use that as a framework for why we do what we do.
I had my chance, but I'm going to jump back in anyway. The other thing I would like to point out is that one of the ways we deal with this is we are occasionally able to make a transition from buying things to buying a service that you do with those things. I think space launch is the perfect example here. We used to buy boosters in order to put satellites in orbit. We don't do that anymore. We buy space launch services. And it works much better in the end. It's more transparent in terms of where the money is going for what. And it allows for, as it turns out, even more competition, right, between vendors, and allows for more innovation in the technologies. So I think it's a win-win for everybody, but we did it by turning something that was a procurement of a product into a procurement of a service.
Okay, I think we're running up on 3 o'clock Eastern. So thanks, panelists. Great papers. I really enjoyed reading them, and I look forward to staying in touch with all of you.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye-bye.